Welcome to Dweller of the Dark. We are a channel honoring the yellowed and blackened bones of many prominent authors. We will be digging up several obscure, strange, and forgotten authors who influenced many of the great horror, science fiction, and fantasy writers today. More tales of the horrifying, obscure, strange, and forgotten are climbing out of the tombs. Subscribe, comment, like, donate, or I'll send Thaddeus Forge to steal your heathen soul. Unknown horror masters, send us ghoulish delights for the Skull and Bones collection. Your pound of writer's flesh will continue to feed our ghouls for now. Books, websites, podcasts, in the links below. Children of Horror, Legion of Ghouls. Tonight, it's a full moon, and there's something that just tried to paw into a community center in the Arizona darkness as we unleash Thomas Swafford's Skinwalker, Chapter 2. Enjoy. Skinwalker, Chapter 2 by Thomas Swafford. First written March 23rd, 2022. 2. A family tradition. I narrowed my gaze and studied the distant horizon of the Badlands. While scratching the stubble of my chin, I felt an icy shudder from peering at the shadows far off in those twisting dark buttes. Then, in the distance, I saw the fiery blast of lightning from a far-off rolling storm. I recalled having been stuck in a few of those over the years. The pelting, stinging rain, the gust that twisted or laid flat the cypress, sage, and towering chaparral. Consciously or not, I flipped up the collar of my shirt, lowered the tip on my cowboy hat, and huddled in with my meal, hoping I wouldn't have to brave any more storms like that. Now I'm kidding myself. The signs are there again. It's a bad omen, seeing a storm like that out in the Badlands. But that storm was miles away in that inhospitable desert. Where I sat, there was no impending storm of doom. It was early morning as the sun climbed slowly and cast a red stain across the western sky as I continued to look further toward the treacherous outcrop of scrublands. I was peering out a dirty window from a bench inside my favorite coffee shop, the Steam and Brew. There I tangled and sat gnawing on a tough-as-leather steak for breakfast, while chewing, cursing, and chewing some more, praying I didn't lose any teeth eating. I caught a glance of Ernesto Lopez and his grandmother. There, they were moving with a poised and easy pace out of the Steam and Brew. I nodded as they went by and out the door. I pondered with my own wincing grin. That smiling boy is one of the few bright spots in this ragged town. As he often sang classic Western tunes or whistled the latest song on a busted radio, the boy would look up like he lived in a Western paradise as he meandered on. I'd watch inconspicuously as he'd take in a prideful breath while his eyes caught a nostalgic shine at this dried-up ghost town. And Ernie, because he was never the peacock-proud name Ernesto to our town, gave us all hope of better times to come. Hell, he might be mayor of this dump one day and bring on real changes to improve our lot. At least, I hoped so. And why wouldn't I believe in Ernie? For there he walked arm in arm with his beloved grandmother, both heading out into a sizzling day as cool as could be, with that same hopeful smiles. And from what I'd known of Ernie with all the townsfolk, he was the moral type of man that could bring in the light. He was, by all accounts, a good kid, a selfless kid, and was fueled by fires of his ageless ambition. A boy turned man on the precipice of dogged youthful exuberance, about 19. Now, if there was a guiding angel in his life that had kept him on the righteous path, it was his grandmother. Her lessons he bore to heart, and her learning had made his wit the sharpest I'd seen in decades. Ernie loved her with all his being, as any grandchild would love and respect their grandparent. There was no one he sacrificed, cared, and loved more than his grandmother, Marissa Lopez. And when Grandma needed to go to the grocery, the pharmacy, or just for a walk, Ernesto didn't blink to obey her every need. But a shadow eclipsed them as they went to leave the Steam and Brew. As Ernie and Marissa were walking out, oblivious at first of the encroaching evil two-horse, both immediately became aware and stopped in their tracks. Ernie's grandmother locked her sky-blue eyes on the desperado and recoiled as if seeing a nasty viper. She pulled Ernie back in the same instant, as if two-horse were a rotting leper. She gave wide berth to something foul, abhorrent, and undoubtedly unpleasant. And she whispered what sounded like a Hail Mary as she genuflected with her right hand and made the sign of the cross. Groaning in disgust at the tire that the cafe called a steak, I stopped eating and pushed back my plate and shook my head. Finishing up my lunch, I slid out of the booth and tossed down a few dollars and paid my bill. Adjusting my hat and breeches, I walked on over toward Ernie and Marissa. I wanted to catch up with the pair before they left. I nodded to his grandmother, then I patted Ernie's shoulder. "Hey, Ernie, how are you doing?"
"Sheriff, please don't arrest me."
Ernie put his hands up jokingly and laughed heartily. I shook my head at his playful antics, gave him a scolding finger, and joined in with the laughter. After a brief moment, I lowered my brow and narrowed my eyes sternly. Well, I'll give you a pass if you do something for me.
How can I help the sheriff?
His eyes went wide with eagerness to assist. It was an endearing, selfless quality that you truly couldn't teach someone. Either a person, man or woman, had empathy and kindness, in my opinion, or they didn't. I continued to explain as we moved outside the diner. My Navajo, of course, isn't very good, but my tireless curiosity is always a bother. I took a deep sigh and pointed toward Two-Horse. I noticed your grandmother avoided that guy when he was leaving. Then she crossed herself afterwards. Ernie looked at his grandmother, then back toward the diner. He put his hand over his brow to block the sun and get a better view of the man I was talking about. When he realized it was Two-Horse, he got a little jumpy and stuttered.
You mean why she reacted to Two-Horse?
I nodded, then continued trying not to look back to the evil man in the diner. Could you ask her why she did that? Then I leaned into both of them, whispering, and I'd appreciate it if you did share this conversation with anyone. If anyone asks why you were talking, just tell them we were shooting the breeze. Ernie rubbed his hands nervously on his pants. Then he turned, sighed slightly, and in Navajo spoke to his grandmother. Their conversation and banter went back and forth for at least a minute as I struggled to catch the gist of it. Marissa Lopez's tired sky-blue eyes darted back and forth under her tanned, wrinkled brow between Ernie and me. I couldn't make out exactly their conversation, but by his imploring gestures and her flailing hands, I figured she was relenting to the questions I had asked. Ernie brought another imploring barrage of questions and pointed to my badge repeatedly as Marissa scoffed. Then finally, I did catch something that echoed like a thunderous landslide in Rattlesnake Canyon. The words lamented to me that somehow Ernie had got her to ease and had gained a temporary trust from the wizened woman. She lowered her head slightly and leaned in. She pulled me and Ernie in close and cupped her hand to whisper in Spanish so as none of the Navajo nearby heard her. Es uno brujo, un muy malo que practica magia negra. Ernie's face went pale and taut. He bared his teeth in utter disgust at this translation. Then he nodded discreetly in the direction of Two Horse. He is a witch, a very bad one who practices black magic. I was a bit surprised at this answer. Or was I? I know it sounds crazy, Sheriff, but she's serious. Ernie's face went taut, and in a slight murmur added, Grandmother, well, she's very sensitive to certain things, spirits, and far worse. He looked around nervously, darting his eyes to make sure we were out of earshot of anyone. I know, one time we went to a house she hadn't been to before. She flailed a bit, not wanting to enter the place. I finally was moving her forward to go in the rundown place when she yelled a warning. Ernesto, very bad things have happened here. We can't go in. He took a deep sigh and cracked his neck before continuing. Would you believe? I found out later that a couple of people were murdered there. Another time, we went by a different collapsing house. She made the sign of the cross and said a solemn prayer. Then she looked on me with her kind eyes and spoke in a whisper. There are spirits inside that one. And let me guess. I paused, already knowing the answer. He finished my rhetorical question with the same morose, superstitious tone I'd found so endearing throughout the community. A friend of mine said it was known for having weird things happen, hauntings, and people disappearing. No one lived there long. Anyone that outstayed their welcome vanished. I could tell the boy truly believed in something, religious or otherwise. I see, Ernie. Then I narrowed my eyes and gave him a warning glare. Don't say anything to anyone about our conversation, okay? I watched as Ernie nodded before I added and nodded in Two Horse's direction. Two Horse has got a bad history of trouble. I don't want either of you to get in his crosshairs. The old grandmother put her hand out in a thankful gesture and nodded as Ernesto explained. Then to her directly I agreed. Ma'am, if it's any consolation, I get a bad feeling from him myself. I nodded and turned away, leaving Ernie and Marissa to make the slow, arduous crawl to their little shop across from the Steaming Brew. I walked with purpose, scanning the town briefly. Then I crossed the street and walked up the rickety porch and went into my office. After 3 cups of tar-black thick coffee and 2 hours of racking my brains on federal paperwork for funding, I'd taken a break and leaned in my chair. While leaning back in the squeaking archaic chair, I rubbed my tired temples. Then sitting forward, I called my deputy John in and had him close the door. I puffed my cheeks, put my hands together in a clasp, shaking my head skeptically. A while ago, someone told me that their relative thought Joe Two Horse was a witch. He's not the good type of witch, as you can imagine by his previous antics. He's the loathsome type of scum who'd naturally be drawn to practice black magic. I waited for John to burst out in uproarious laughter. Hell, I'd probably join in and slap my leg cackling away. But when John slightly lowered his head and winced, I got a little concerned. He raised his head slightly, turned his neck from side to see if anyone else was around to hear him. Then he replied with a furrowed brow of concern. I don't believe all this black magic, mind you, Sheriff. I think most of these superstitious nutcases huffed too much glue back in the day. And when it comes to Brujo Benally, Two Horse's great uncle, There's a fire burning brightly beneath all his smoke and mirrors to make a man wonder about all this supernatural stuff. I couldn't dismiss all brujo banale stories as bullshit. I was taken aback with an incredulous disbelief. For starters, why had I never heard of this guy in all my years living in the desert? Second, the most skeptical and pragmatic man I'd known in all my years of law enforcement was starting to sound like that crazy reporter who rambled through a few years back spouting on about subterranean lizard people. I believe his name was Kojak or something like it. I grimaced and asked, who in all hell's creation was this Bruno Benali? And how come I never knew this scumbag had a witch great uncle? Sheriff, he was way before your time. May I sit to explain? I nodded and ushered John to sit. He moved swiftly and sat down. Then casually, to get comfortable, he leaned back in his chair and continued while I got him a cup of the world's finest coal tar coffee. I poured the black goo coffee into a nearby styrofoam cup, then handed it to my best deputy as I sat back down, realizing this story might take a while. Go on, I'm all ears, deputy. He was an old Navajo that probably only came into town only a few times in his life. If I were to guess, he'd seen a lot during the American and Indian Wars as a child. Heck, for all I know, he probably sat at many firesides with Geronimo. I smiled slightly as he said the name of the legendary Indian chief who had wreaked havoc on the U.S. Army during those wars. Every Indian I'd met around here claimed to be his descendant or have some history with Geronimo. John took a deep breath and hesitantly sipped his coffee, puckering his face in obvious distaste to the brew. He had as little to do with whites and white culture as possible. I don't think he spoke any English, just Navajo and some Spanish. I forget what his real first name was. Oh, people didn't call him Brujo Benali to his face either, out of bona fide fear. Anyway, I saw him one time as a kid. My neighbor, Fred, helped raise me and took me out and showed me an old Navajo trading post. John took another sip of his coffee and almost retched to my wicked delight. Then rolling his eyes at my smirk, he shrugged and went on. He told me how that's all a lot of them used. Fred explained how so many of the old ones didn't even speak English. He pointed out Brujo Benali to me. He was an old man, and not big or strong looking, but there was just something scary about him. I noticed that even the other Navajos in the store seemed nervous around him. At one point, he cast his black, lifeless eyes on me. I swear, Sheriff, that cruel gaze seemed to burn through me. I'm not going to lie. I almost pissed my pants. That has to be some type of evil to ever make you lose your water, John. I crossed my arms, gave a slight nod for him to continue. John half cocked his head, and he seemed to recall more of the evil witch. Then he raised his right brow slightly. He didn't say anything, but it was as if he was saying, "Get out of here, white boy." I mean, he didn't say anything, but somehow I knew exactly what he was thinking. Shit, I was a puny, nervous kid. I stared at this relic of a man from a bygone era, a walking Indian mummy, complete with his own bag of curses, and just looked at him. His eyes smoldered red coals beneath that weathered, leathered brow. His eyes, those fiery eyes, burned like a brush fire, with all the hate of the world carried in them. John looked out my office window a moment before continuing. I could see he was really lost in his childhood past for a moment, and he turned back and locked his eyes on mine. It was Fred that told me. He said cowboys and Indians alike mentioned in a whisper, cajoled in a murmur, or wrote it secretly between them that Brujo Banali was the most sinister of men. He was the embodiment of hell on earth and the conjurer of blackest magic. He was a witch, and the nastiest of the sort to instill the kind of numbing fear across the desert. Anyone who crossed him, or not, paid a heavy price to his black magic. I widened my eyes, uncrossed my arms, and pushed back my cowboy hat, incredulously to what John was telling me. I asked the next reasonable question. And your neighbor, your friend Fred, believed this guy was a witch? I don't know if Fred believed any of it, but he watched the folks and the fear they carried around here and up in the Badlands. He knew something was off with Brujo Banali. So, whether he believed didn't matter. What mattered was that the people he cared about and loved were scared of the man. The town believed Brujo Banali was indeed a witch. John leaned in and rested both his elbows on his knees and lowered his head. Do you remember me telling you that Joe Two-Horse went to college on a football scholarship? I slapped my hands together, slightly annoyed and bored. Yes, I do believe you mentioned it in passing. Well, he was up against another Navajo kid, and suddenly that kid got sick. John raised his eyes, and I saw what exactly. I won't say John was terrified, but there was a look in his eyes that was close. I mean, he came down with some bad problems, both physical and mental, just out of nowhere. There were rumors that a witch had cast a spell on him. I half grinned and shook my head. John had to be pulling my leg. I couldn't accept my #1 deputy was falling for the local superstitions around here. Then I asked an obvious question that had been bugging me for the last decade. Is that one reason people don't press charges against him? John paused a moment before answering. He was hesitant to say any more. I couldn't guess in the moment if it were out of his own misgivings or the shame that I'd ridicule him. Possibly, it might have been both. Finally, he took a deep, controlled breath and answered. Yep. They won't turn in their black magic brujo out of a healthy and albeit cautious fear of retaliation. Folks, especially the Indians, know Two-Horse's lineage carries a weight in this world and the worlds beyond the veil. He's a dark practitioner, as was Brujo Banali, in league with demons, magic, ghosts, and their ilk. It was inevitable that Two-Horse would follow the same dark path as his great uncle. Their black blood, their dark masters, their evil minions demands it. Evil, like the universe, knows the path it must follow long before we do. My mouth was dry and coarse at what John had just spouted to me. I knew I needed another cup of coffee and stood to get one. I paused a minute to see if John needed one. Naturally, he declined. After filling my cup and letting John's words sink in, I asked as I gulped down the bitter shot of Java, "How do you know all this?" He looked out toward the desert from my dusty window. I saw he caught a glimpse of the distant Badlands. He spoke, but his mind seemed to drift off someplace else. It's not easy, boss. You know as well as I do that the Navajo are a tight-lipped bunch. The medicine man, or the brujo, gets 10 times the respect and fear as a lawman. Even all the countless hours of reading and research I do is limited by interpretation and the accuracy of the writers. I can't tell you how many times I threw a book in frustration, having wasted my time on lies and untruths. I can second that frustration, John. I took another sip of my bitter brew and thought of my own life through the years paralleled with this noxious, bitter cup of coffee. Nothing fires me up more than reading 3/4 of some police manual or a detective novel, only to have the writer totally miss the point of what they were trying to say. You know what I mean? The moment when things go south, or the shit hits the fan, and the author failed to stick the landing. I totally get your rage at that, boss. John nodded in agreement and leaned back in his chair. I wanted to groan when he did that. It signaled to me my deputy had a lot more on his chest. Sheriff, there's more I researched beyond the books that did help somewhat. I have had a few Navajo friends that talk to me more than they did most Belagana. Maybe it's my calm, gentle persuasion. We both chuckled. And I added, sure it was. What was her name? John's face went red with embarrassment that I knew more of his surveillance and research than he expected. Sir, a gentleman never tells. I laughed some more as John bristled and grinned sheepishly. We both knew that John had been far from a gentleman with the ladies back in the day. Undaunted, he shrugged off my inquiry with a dismissive hand and continued. Anyway, I've always liked folklore, mythology, things like that. The Navajo appreciated that I was respectful of their people and traditions. They told me things in confidence. A lot of the older Navajo would never appreciated them sharing. So here's the brass tacks of that research with the athlete that took ill mysteriously. I saw a shadow come across my troubled deputy's face. His jaw seemed to clench as John pointed out toward the reservation. Many thought that either Two Horse or his great uncle cast a spell on that poor boy at the college. Their magic was so powerful that it didn't just make the guy sick. It killed him. And the Navajo told you that? I gave a wry grin of skepticism, then shaking my head, I huffed, a disbelieving protest. Horse manure! It's the truth, sir. I swear that's what the Indians believe. Trust me when I say they don't break ranks ever to divulge stories like that to a guy like me. Telling an outsider, especially a white guy, is very taboo to them and can be lethal if the brujo gets wind of it. So, Sherlock, what else did you discover in your research? I mean to say, what else came out of your investigation besides how good Miss Two Feathers was in the sack? I gave a knowing Cheshire grin to my scoundrel of a deputy and watched him tense up at my question. Did I ruffle your feathers? I'd obviously ruffled some feathers, pun intended. Wincing at my pun, he continued, flushed with embarrassment. I found out later, not only was Brujo Benali supposed to be a witch, he was believed to be a skinwalker. What the hell is a skinwalker? I recoiled back, slightly puzzled by the word. It was a term that I had never heard before my conversation with John. Obviously, I hadn't got out into the reservation as much as my number one to learn of such things. A skinwalker is a Navajo witch that has the ability to change their form. A shapeshifter, if you will. A skinwalker can take on the appearance or form of an animal to have its powers. Are you saying what I think you are saying, John? I slightly closed my right eye and stared intensely at John. I put my hands up dismissively. Is this thing the Navajo believe in like a werewolf in those old horror movies? John looked to the ceiling and took an anguished breath. I could tell I had him rattled by my dubious conjecture. Yes, Sheriff. A lot of cultures have shape-shifting creatures in their lore, coincidentally. He took out his phone and scrolled through a few while he continued explaining. Werewolf legends originated in the Black Forest of Germany and all across the woodlands of France. In the western areas of Abeokuta and all across Africa, there are legends of hoodoo practitioners and their ability to transform into were hyenas. China and Japan had legends people turning into sneaky and wise foxes. Where foxes in Japan? And I thought that was only limited to the Happy Rabbit Club down in Nevada. I gave a hearty laugh and saw John smirk and shake his head, frustrated at my obvious skepticism. Good one, Sheriff. He pointed back to his phone and strove to give me more on the history of shapeshifters. Now, the movies had the people as being a victim of a curse. In a lot of the folklore, these people actually have practiced black magic or made forbidden pacts. Skinwalkers can also turn into crows, owls, wolves, but the main animal seems to be coyotes. These animals have certain abilities that the skinwalkers can use, like deception, incredible speeds while running, sharper vision than a human, and of course, that keen sense of smell. I had about a bellyful of the shapeshifter nonsense. To antagonize and get John out of my office, I asked a question to aggravate him to the point to leave. So, occult detective, how are these stalking skinwalkers made? I realized my attempt to dissuade and get my supernatural enthusiast deputy out of my hair had failed. Well, sir, let me tell you. I almost growled myself as he went on. The Navajo name for them translates into "it goes on all fours," but they very rarely use the name. They believe that saying it out loud will attract them. Skinwalkers are initiated into a secret society. Generally, the leader is an old man. The problem is, to become one, they have to commit a major taboo. One of the taboos is killing a close relative. It's kind of a Faustian pact. I can totally get the Faustian pact. I feel like I made one when I had you come into my office to tell me about skinwalkers. I grinned devilishly and watched John tense, annoyed at my slight. John rolled his eyes and continued to explain. You can't get great powers, but you're pretty much damned. For example, a skinwalker, after making the pact with the dark forces or demons, may have to feed on dead corpses or something a whole lot worse. Also, they have to use the pelt of a specific animal in order to gain powers of that animal. During the day, they look normal. It's at night that they transform and do their evil. They are totally ass naked during the initiations and usually when they commit their horrific acts. Among the unsavory things they do is dig up graves so they can use body parts to do magic. I raised my brows and put my elbows on my desk, then placing my hands together in a makeshift prayer as I inquired, bored, what can they do besides change into an animal? Besides changing into a stalking beast to hunt you down like a hopping hare, which is more than enough for me, they can do a lot more. John leaned back in his chair, having tired showing me ad nauseum more skinwalker pictures and articles than I ever cared to see. One of their powers, besides transformation, is total mental control over other animals, including people. Other skills deal with their ability to bring on illness and plagues, just like the European and American witches. And again, just like their counterparts across the pond, they can cause bad crops, death, insanity, strife, windstorms, mimic the voice of people, and even the sounds of animals. Finally, if that weren't evil enough, some have telepathic and telekinesis to know or influence your thinking. Oh, I know a skinwalker like that now. I gave John a mischievous smile as he waited for my answer, puzzled. Elon Musk. It's called Neuralink. I howled with laughter as John cursed under his breath. Again, looking perturbed, John shook his head, continuing. So, as I was saying, Sheriff, they can control someone's thoughts. They can mesmerize their victims by looking into their eyes. This is truly the critical part, sir, especially if you are trying to best one of these villains. Their eyes seem to be important and a giveaway. Even if they are in animal form, their eyes look human. On the other hand, when they are human, their eyes can look like the eyes of the animal whose powers they are using to change. I'll keep that in mind if we ever come across one. Or if a blue-eyed buzzard gives me a stir, I'll howl the second time. Watching John's face turn red, realizing I wasn't buying any of his Skinwalker rhetoric. John sighed deeply and slumped his shoulders. Sheriff, I know you don't believe in this Navajo stuff, but years out here in the desert and living next to the Navajo reservation has opened my eyes and mind to the possibility there's more in this world. He locked his tired, bloodshot eyes on mine. A shaman that turn bad and become skinwalkers, become drunk on their power, twisted by the evil that early in life they swore to defend their people against. What's that saying? Be careful chasing monsters. You might eventually become one. Many medicine men start out as legitimate shamans, helping the ill and infirmed. John stood and looked out the window at a windblown pine. But just as a weathered tree over time is twisted and weathered in the dark night winds, so too the medicine man might be twisted and bent to the dark winds of evil. And this corruption happened to Brujo Banali? I had a suspicion I had already hunted out the answer, but I had to hear John's explanation as to the why everyone thought him a skinwalker now. John turned from the window and walked back to his chair. As he sat, he nodded in agreement. He rubbed his chin and narrowed his eyes before continuing. Two Horse's great uncle, Brujo Banali, was said to have been a respected Hastin, a renowned medicine man at one point. You know how a black mass is supposed to be a corruption of a holy mass? Well, once Brujo Banali turned evil, his ceremonies became blasphemies of his original oath. He corrupted the sacred Navajo ceremonies, possessed and craving power and vengeance. He'd do things, spells, telepathy, telekinesis, or worse, to hurt people he hated. And in Brujo Banali's case, and many of the Brujos and Brujas, they feed off the pain they cause like a drug. I leaned forward and took a deep breath. I guess you know what I'm going to ask next, John. Is there no accountability within the Navajo community to make these skinwalkers heal and follow the sacred oaths of the shaman? Becoming a skinwalker is their reckoning, Sheriff. John frowned and looked on me with tired eyes. He was winding down from all his lecture and tales of witchcraft and creatures of the night. To be one is a death sentence in the Navajo tradition. Once a shaman becomes a brujo and then a skinwalker, they give up their right to live. The ultimate trade-off is power to usurp the divine plan of their creators. Some eventually become so powerful they actually can change the natural order of our world. These skinwalkers can become necromancers like those from the ancient books down in Harry Plano's bookstore. They learn from all manner of dusty ancient tomes to create hell-bent rituals to summon the dead or far worse. John leaned in and almost whispered, "And one more thing, Dale, that gives me the jitters. I figure probably the longer a brujo is a skinwalker, the lesser their humanity. Devoid of empathy, of kindness, and of love, their evil master fills the brujo's very heart and soul with infinite forbidden knowledge and intoxicating, malignant power to do whatever unspeakable acts of mischief and violence this demoniac entity demands. A skinwalker commits tortured acts so heinous that they break our will spiritually and mentally before we pray, for death. On one hand, I thought John was bona fide nuts. On the other, I felt left out of a secret society or cult. All of what he was saying had been relegated to secret. That part kind of hurt my pride of being a great detective. It was so odd that I'd lived most of my life here by these people and knew so little about their gods, their demons, and most certainly the Navajo culture. But then I thought as I looked over to John and grimaced. I'm good at figuring out puzzles or games once I know there's been one put in front of me. Besides, the Navajo are great at evading questions and stonewalling even the regular day-to-day cases. As I've learned, they are very private about so many things, especially when it involves their religion and traditions. But it's downright frustrating. You can know people and families for years, but that doesn't mean they are going to tell you about all the skeletons in their closet. Shameful questions like who dipped the kid in calf's blood? Why is the chief walking out of his cousin's house at 2 a.m? Or your all-time favorite, who's the real baby daddy of their sister's kids? Romulus and Remus. I saw John look at me puzzled. I leaned back and explained. One of the Roman werewolf legends of the mythical founders of Rome. The boys were nursed by a wolf. I gave John a wry smile and continued. Then there's that guy that pissed off Zeus. That guy is supposed to be the first werewolf. I guess what I'm getting at, John, is neither the Romans nor Greeks actually believe all shapeshifter stuff. Is that what we have here? Or are these just stories to scare the kids from doing bad things? John looked up to the ceiling, deciding on something. If I had to guess, it was another story to assert the point he'd been making. He sighed and pulled his chair in closer to my desk. Let me put it to you like this. The Navajo elders strongly believe skinwalkers are real. I have caught a late-night meeting secretly and heard them espouse, terrified to having seen them or witnessed the horrible mischievous things they had done. I took a gulp of my black goo, feeling the acid eating at my throat, then ushered John to wrap it up. John coughed a minute. I figured his voice must have been getting tired of working so much, or his jaws were cramping from running his traps so long. But then he leaned his elbows on my desk and interlocked his fingers before continuing. I'm not telling you second or third party encounters, Sheriff. These aren't old wives' tales or something a blockhead heard from their grandfather back when he was a kid. People talk about supernatural things around here, sir, especially if they are panicked about what they saw, and it goes triple on the full moon. One guy, Charlie Custer, ran up to my vehicle wide-eyed and babbling like a newborn babe just last month when the moon glistened like a cave skull. I smelled the piss on him and saw he was wet in the trousers. I almost retched as Charlie blathered about a wolf thing chasing him, his dad and uncle while hunting. He went to screaming at everyone walking outside during the harvest festival to get indoors or they'd be killed. I cocked my brow and narrowed my gaze. I remember that lunatic John. I was at a convention over in Tucson when that went down. My wife was quite shaken up, having to spend the night in the community center. By the way, didn't we arrest Charlie for public intoxication? Yes, but he wasn't really drunk, Sheriff. He was scared shitless. Hell, I'll admit it, sir. We all were scared shitless. John looked out to the window toward the Badlands and shivered, recalling that long moonlit night. Once the mayor and councilmen pushed everyone into the community center and church, Charlie helped lock them in. They nailed boards over the windows, blocked the chimney, and pushed the table against the door. From what I recall later, Charlie, his dad, and uncle sat in the middle of the community center. Mr. Custer and most of the Navajo chanted some type of protection prayer. Sheriff, I swear it was unnerving what happened. All night, I heard whimpering of a dog wanting to come in out of the cold. It sounded like your average stray pooch trying to come in to warm up, whining, scratching the door, and pawing. But as the night wore on and its tricks didn't fool us, it growled in a rage. The pawing and scratching intensified on the door, at the windows, and even across the roof. The dog, or whatever it was, had to be rabid or worse. What could be worse than a rabid dog, Deputy? I scowled, ready for this conversation to be over. John's words were starting to affect me. I didn't like that my pulse was quickening and cold sweat had started on my brow. What if it hadn't been a dog? What if what the Navajo had told me was true? He unclenched his hands, then John wiped his own sweat off his brow. Something larger than a dog, larger than a coyote or wolf, and even a bear, was running across the community center rooftop while it laughed and howled. No one, and I mean no one, slept a wink with that kind of ruckus. The next day, after it got light, Charlie and his family headed home. Can you believe? They found their prized calf, Mirabelle, ripped to bloody shreds. The only way they knew it was even a cow butchered was by her gnawed-on belt strap. An old shaman came over and did a ritual, but his parents moved soon after that. Believe me, this guy wasn't lying. Did you follow up on Mirabelle's murder? Charlie really loved that calf. I gave John a stern, knowing stare. And of course I followed up, sir, especially when Charlie went to bawling right here in this very office. I asked him to take me out to where it happened, and he said, "By the love of God, Deputy John, I wouldn't bring that kind of black magic on you. To protect you and all you hold dear, I'm politely saying no." I hated every damn word of John's tale. Maybe hate was too strong a word in this case. I loathed every detail and every reference to damn skinwalkers. The story made my stomach tighten, as it had done back in the war. It made my bladder want to unload in my chair. And most of all, it sent chills up and down my ragged, aged spine. Or should I drink the Kool-Aid and gobble down every word John and witnesses were saying as gospel? John was trying to get me to buy into mythology, shapeshifters, werewolves, and God knows what all. If this story and the stories of the townfolk held a smidgen of truth, we had a major threat to face and kill. If our Skinwalker was just a homicidal mass murderer, then the same held true. At any rate, a legitimate threat to the community was out there, and I wasn't going to abide by it, stalking and murdering my citizens. Wrestling with his tale in the light of day made it easy for me to blow it off as a prank. But I'd heard his research. I'd read countless case files he'd mentioned. And then there was the community center incident during the Harvest Festival. I'd had quite a few sleepless nights with my wife after the ordeal and her nightmares. So, I backtracked toward my original question to myself. Was John's story and these respected townsfolk's stories the God's honest truth? I leaned toward yes. As crazy as that might have sounded, I was beginning to believe some rogue Indian priest or shaman had tapped into something that had made him a monster. Then in true monster fashion, he passed on his evil to his descendants to wreak all kinds of misery. And certainly, I could empathize with the victims of these monsters, I could understand how terrifying it was to everyone involved, especially a child. But did he grow claws and fangs? Was this monster we were about to hunt a supernatural being? I doubted it wholeheartedly, but my belief didn't matter. If Two Horse and his devilish ilk believed, then that concerned me. If they thought themselves above accountability, if they killed people that crossed them, then supernatural creature or not, they'd have to be put down. Whatever happened to Two Horse's great uncle, Brujo Benally? I asked. John looked from side to side mischievously. He leaned back and gave a casual shrug as he grinned broadly. No one knows, Sheriff. Or, to put it politely, they're not saying. Brujo Benally disappeared while Two Horse was in jail for the assault on that girl. John stood to leave. He turned and paused in mid-stride to glance back. I might have mentioned earlier he was thought to be a witch and a skinwalker. A lot of Navajo thought he put a scale on that other kid so his great-nephew could win a scholarship. With that said, the Navajo believe that a skinwalker has no right to live. Honestly, Sheriff, in my heart, I believe the Navajo elders got together and voted to rid themselves of Brujo Benally. Others think some of the townsfolk squared the problem themselves. What we know for sure, Brujo Benally never came to town again. He had very little connections to the outside world. It wasn't hard for him just to go away. I gave a knowing nod and added, well, whatever happened, it probably made Two Horse one bitter bastard, especially if they got rid of Brujo Benally while he was cooling his heels behind bars. Two Horse has to live with the fact someone got rid of his favorite relative, and he couldn't do anything about it. I think a lot of the Navajo wish he disappeared with Brujo Benally. John turned and adjusted his hat while walking out, then called back as he waved a hand toward me, walking back to his desk. Like I said, he's always been a bullying scum. But all these stories are coming from Navajo. I yelled back and watched John bristle, realizing he had forgotten to tell me something. Have you ever heard a story from a Bilagana that gives any credence to these powers? I thought I had tripped him up, but then I realized as he walked back in that I didn't. As a matter of fact, I did, John said with a smirk. I knew this guy who used to be a regular Casanova. John could see my confusion. Sheriff the Clown was a real ladies' man and scoundrel. The fool was juggling and dallying dozens of women at once. Is this guy a friend of yours? I gave a wicked smile back to my whore-dog deputy. John rolled his eyes. He was neither. Anyway, he started seeing this one Navajo girl who took a shine to him like he was a shiny new penny. People warned the dummy repeatedly, don't mess with her, or if you two hook up, don't cheat on her. These same concerned people warned our wayward fool that this particular Navajo girl was bruja and practiced magic. The beanpole laughed and blew them off. The fool said, my Navajo gal is as pretty as a lily and warmer than a campfire, and her kitty purrs all night long. The girl, Morning Star, had warned our hapless philandering fool. I'm a jealous, unforgiving woman. Never lie or cheat on me, or I'll know. I know the idiot. I saw John wince, realizing he had said the girl's name and let the cat out of the bag. Beanpole Revet, the ugliest son of a bitch I ever encountered, kicking a can down the road like a one-titted gimp. And you say that guy was a ladies' man?
He was, sir, a long time ago.
John nodded and continued his boring, ill-fated romance tale.
Beanpole thought he was Mr. Smooth. He actually believed he could get away with anything.
What happened to him? I asked.
Well, Beanpole took another girl out one night. It was out in the desert where they kicked off a torrid romance. A day later, he saw Morning Star. He could tell by her casual stare, her icy demeanor, and reserved looks that something was up. The tip-off was she wasn't giving him a round of screaming nor going crazy. Beanpole gave an innocent smile and acted like all was fine between them. Morning Star looked him straight in his chestnut eyes and asked if he'd had fun on his date. The fool tried and failed to lie. He did his best to pretend like he didn't have any idea what she was talking about. She called his bluff and told him exactly where he took the other girl. She went into every detail of exactly what they did, all the intricacies he and the girl's activities. Beanpole was stunned into silence by the depth of what she knew. It was as if Morningstar had been right there and saw the whole deceitful thing. Shrugging my shoulders, I mentioned with my whole disbelief. Maybe he wasn't as well hidden as he thought. Maybe this girl had some binoculars. Beanpole said that wasn't the case. They were where no one could see them from any other vantage point, even with binoculars. And there was no way she could have gotten close enough to watch without him knowing. This guy was good at finding places to hook up and not get caught. I held my hands up and asked, "So how did she know?" Leaning forward on my table with his elbows, John looked at me and said, "He told me that there was this owl that was up on a tree limb watching them. He said it struck him as odd that it didn't fly away, but just sat and watched them." Suddenly, evidently remembering something, John pointed his finger at me and added, "He even made the comment that it must be enjoying the show." Leaning back in the chair, John continued, "After that, this guy started having some health issues. He was losing weight and had no energy. He went to his doctor, who sent him to one specialist after another. None of them could find anything organically wrong with him. Some wanted to send him for psychological evaluations. One of his Navajo friends that had warned him of the witch saw his decline. The friend was shocked and frightened for Beanpole. He took the guy to his uncle, who was a Haston. His uncle took one look at him and told Beanpole that someone had put a spell on him. He got some other Hastini, and they did some singings and ceremonies for him. That seemed to break the spell. After that, he settled down, got married, and behaved himself. He told me that he could just feel his life being drained out of him at the time. It all seemed to be more than I could accept. John, are you telling me that you think that this friend of yours got hexed by a woman that could turn herself into an owl?" My deputy and friend just leaned forward, looked at me, and said, "Remember when I told you what the Navajo name was for skinwalkers? I didn't actually say the name in Navajo. If it is true that saying their name attracts them, I don't care to do that. Dale, just because you don't believe in something doesn't mean it doesn't or cannot exist. The universe isn't dependent on your personal paradigm. It's not about conforming to or caring about your beliefs. There was this French chemist in the 18th century that dismissed meteorites. He said that rocks are heavier than air, so how could they fall out of the sky? I have heard that Clara Barton, who started the Red Cross, never believed in the idea of germs. Their beliefs didn't keep them from being wrong." John's last few comments were true. I thought about
what Ernesto Lopez told me about his grandmother's abilities. I also knew John well. He wasn't someone that ran his mouth just to hear himself talk, to impress others, or see what he could get you to believe. I started to think maybe there were things I didn't know existed, and that there were things I didn't want to exist. At that point, I had no idea of the events that were going to occur. And the damn phone rang.
Sheriff Gale, there's blood splattered everywhere and chunks of somebody tossed on the roof. It's so bad, I can't even tell you who got murdered.
Thank you for listening.
Have a great night.